Hey guys, it's Dean. Welcome to the Better Man podcast. Today is an interview episode, and I've got my friend Garrett Salpeter here from NeuFit, and we're going to be talking about pain. We're going to be talking about Garrett's experience with pain, the solutions that he's developed to that, and this is something that when I'm experiencing pain, this is the guy whose service that I like to go to because it's a really cool modality. So, but that aside, we are going to get into pain science, and I think this is going to be a really interesting discussion because I know most of you guys do have pain. So, Garrett, thanks for being here.
Dean, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity here and excited to dive in.
Yeah. So, let's get started. So, I always like to start these off telling how I know the guest. So, Garrett and I met at a conference a few years ago, and I remember going up to the booth, and I forgot what exactly the pitch was, but they're like, "Yeah, just we're gonna hook it on you, and we're gonna do some stuff." I was like, "Okay, cool, let's do it." And so, so they put these. So I think it might have been even been you there at the time. So let's just assume that it was Garrett. So Garrett hooks up these nodes to me, these sticky pads connected to a machine, and he puts them on muscle on certain parts of the muscles, and then he switches the knobs, turns up the dial, and you feel this incredibly strong contraction in the muscles. And what was really cool about this was most of us have difficulty with firing muscles in certain areas. You know, if you guys have done my workouts, you'll know that there's a big focus on muscle engagement and that it's not always automatic to get these muscles to fire or to turn on. And so what was unique was that this machine allowed those muscles to fire. So it helped to connect it helped with your mind body connection essentially, so that if you were unable to get let's say your glutes to fire, or let's say your scapular stabilizers or a specific part of your rotator cuff, then this machine allowed you to understand what that muscle engagement felt like and to help train your mind body connection. And for me, that was incredible. And it also helped me make improvements that I probably wouldn't have been able to make without it. So that's how I met Garrett. I've been on and off using NeuFit whenever I need it for the last few years. We had it at the Be the Better You retreat that we did in November. So it's just a really cool modality, and I'm excited to have this interview to talk more about pain as a whole and understand that pain is not just physical. There's a very big neurological component to it. So we're going to get into that, and yeah, that's how I know Garrett. So that's my story. So yeah, Garrett, maybe you can tell us a bit more, just an overview about yourself.
Yeah, happy to do it. So, my background is engineering and neuroscience, and I had been an athlete and just like many athletes was very frustrated, disappointed with the traditional orthopedic medicine, traditional physical therapy with various injuries that I had. Until my last year in college, I had another injury where I had some torn ligaments. I was told I was going to have to get surgery and be out for 3 months. And I was devastated as an athlete, my last year in college and all this stuff. And fortunately, I met a doctor who was doing functional neurology and using older versions of direct current. And so I worked with this doctor, and he showed me, about this functional neurology concept, and it's essentially looking at not just the tissues that are torn or broken, not just looking at the bones, the ligaments, the muscles, etc., but looking at the neurological response to injury, how the nervous system might be guarding or shutting down muscles, trying to restrict movement, kind of imposing this whole suite of protective patterns on the body, and pain is a part of that too. So we can plant that seed, and we'll come back to that. And then he was also using direct current, taking advantage, well, not like a microcurrent at the time, but taking advantage of these electric fields and their ability to influence the body's own healing and regenerative processes. And long story short, I ended up healing my ligaments in 3 weeks, avoiding surgery, getting back on the ice. And I was so relieved and happy as an athlete. But as a physics major, as a pre-engineering student, to find something that made sense scientifically from first principles, that's what really got me excited. That's what really spoke to me. And going through that experience, this is now nearly 20 years ago. I felt called to share something about that. I just felt called to share that with as many people as I could because it felt like a truly better way. And so for the next 7 or 8 years, I sort of had this, what I call my laboratory phase, where I had a clinic within a clinic with a chiropractor, originally in the office of the chiropractor who took care of the University of Texas Longhorns football team, rented a room there, started using older versions of direct current, and for about 7 or 8 years, kept refining the methodology, learning from other people, went back for additional graduate school work in neuroscience, and then finally decided, after just waiting for people to come out with newer technology that would sort of modernize and this category of direct current technology and allow it to do the things that I wished for it to be able to do. After waiting and waiting, finally, I just said, all right, I'm going to do it myself, and decided to develop the NEUBIE, and then we launched that. That was a couple of year project, and then we launched that about 6.5 years ago. So I've been really focused on sharing that with as many people as possible for this last 7 years or so.
Gotcha. Yeah, that really resonates with, that sounds really similar to my story in a lot of ways. I got injured. I was injured as well. My last year of my senior year of college playing lacrosse. And so I was out for, I want to say, a month. I had a high ankle sprain, and I was kind of really upset about that because I had started yoga that year. So I was like, oh, I can't get injured now because I'm doing yoga. Right. And no, that's not how injuries work. So yeah, I was injured for the last month, and I've been in and out of knee braces my entire life. I think I had my first partial patellar sublux. Sorry, my first partial wasn't patellar subluxation, or it was patellar subluxation. I always forget the name, but I had my kneecap came out partially the first time when I was 13, I think, and it just recurred until I think the last episode I had was maybe 25 years old, and yeah, it just sucks. Being injured as an athlete is really frustrating, but you do learn a lot from that. But those learnings aside, it's really frustrating being injured, and for you to say that you went from an injury that should have taken 3 months to heal to 3 weeks is really intriguing to me, especially because a lot of if you're listening to this and you're in your 50s or your 60s or even late 40s, I think the previous, maybe even if you're in your 40s, but the previous mentality with injuries wasn't rehab, it was rest until it heals. And I'm wondering if, Garrett, maybe you can speak to this, but when did that, do you know when that changed in physical therapy world, when people started, instead of letting things rest, they started, because now I know if you get a hip replacement, you're on the table like the next day starting to rehab it. It's not, you're not just sitting there waiting for it to heal. You're doing stuff to get blood flow, to restore range of motion, to start getting those muscles working again. So I'm wondering, do you know when that all switched?
So the RICE paradigm, the rest, ice, compression, and elevation paradigm,
Mm,
sort of took hold. Gosh, I want to say in the 1980s. Gabe Merkin is the famous doctor that sort of coined that term, and then in the last several years came out and reversed course. He said,
right.
there's a better way of doing this." So I
Yeah.
remember his name from reading the reports of that, but it's sort of been a slow trend over the last 20 years or so, where for instance, someone had the idea to test out continuous passive motion machines on people after knee surgery, and so that became part of it, where people would actually lay down at home in a machine that's just passively bending and
Mm,
straightening their leg for them, so it doesn't stiffen up and it recovers better. We see that movement helps reduce that stiffening, and just keeps everything working better, because not only do the tissues not get as stiff, but then that allows for better blood flow, which of course supports the body's healing process, because it not only now has to recover from the injury, it has to recover from the extreme trauma of surgery, which is very traumatic to the body.
yeah.
So it's been one of these things where people do one study and look at it in one condition, adding movement. Then like, okay, that works. Then maybe we'll try it in another condition. It's sort of like whack-a-mole, sort of like start adding in more activity for one condition. But I think comes from the visionary people who had the idea, like, hey, the body does, if you just sit around and do nothing, the signal to your body is actually to downregulate, to make less energy, to make this the new set point, to not invest as much energy and resources in building back up and repairing and regenerating. So there's some visionary people who understood physiology who said, you know what, let's try introducing some more movement, and then
Mm,
just sort of gain ground condition by condition by condition. But even still, there's a lot of people who think of that rice paradigm, and who still aren't really bought into that notion of wanting to be more active as part of stimulating the body. And there's times where if someone, you just have a surgical graft and you really don't want to put more than 50 newtons worth of force or something through it because it could tear for a period of time. I mean, that is still sensible, but you want to move everything else around it and do as much as you can within the safety parameters, because within those safety parameters that you have, because then the signal is just like with exercise, the signal is actually to repair, to rebuild, to increase blood
hmm
flow, to increase protein synthesis so you can make new tissue, and all these wonderful things. So recovering from an injury is a lot, if you really look at it, is a lot like recovering from exercise. And you're intentionally depleting the body, causing micro trauma as a signal then, because those proteins, those breakdown byproducts, act as a signal for the body to rebuild. It doesn't just rebuild anywhere, it rebuilds exactly where those metabolites have built up, because they're the messengers that call
mm,
the body into action, and call the raw materials and resources there to rebuild and repair.
got it. Yeah, and I think I like that you mentioned that. So thinking about that recovery, not just as resting and waiting for it to get better, but doing the appropriate movements, the appropriate exercises or modalities that send the appropriate stimulus to the body to help with the recovery. And I think the really interesting thing about rice is that it's so ingrained in people that at this point, it's not just a fact that can be easily switched off in your brain. It's like people have this deeply emotional connection to rice. And so you see people who have been doing rice their entire lives, and they're in their, 50s, 60s now, and their PT saying like, hey, okay, we don't do rice anymore. And they're like, I'm going to keep doing rice. Like they still do it, even though, we have studies that say, hey, we were wrong. Rice isn't the right thing to do. And that's not to say that there are things that there are components of rice that aren't effective, and that some of it is sometimes helpful. Like ice is good if you want to get rid of pain, so you can use ice to get rid of pain, but that also slows down the circulation. So it's a short term, okay, this really hurts, I'm going to put ice on it, but it comes at, the expense of the law of the recovery. And then for elevation, if you do have a lot of swelling, then correct me if I'm wrong, but elevation is helpful if you do have, am I right on that?
Yeah, I
Maybe
mean,
I'm wrong.
gravity will help pull fluids down. You know, the fluids that are there should be, well. There's a couple different thoughts on that too. Actually, in terms of pain, since you mentioned that too, ice
Mm,
can't get rid of pain. But then there's a question of, do we want to mask the pain, or do we want to fix the problem? Right? I mean,
mm,
sometimes you can have compassion for people if there's a lot of pain, but just know if you're using ice or taking anti-inflammatories or something like that, it's sort of like if your house is burning down and the fire alarm is going off. It's like taking the fire alarm and turning it off instead of actually fixing the fire.
yeah,
So pain is a signal, and we'll get in. I know we're going to get into the pain.
yeah.
Pain is a signal. In terms of elevation, uh, so swelling, there's a couple things. There's one question of, if swelling's happening, there's a reason for it, and part of that
hmm
reason is that in our blood we have red blood cells that I think people know, and then there's blood plasma. There's kind of the liquid medium, that liquid milieu, and that's what carries proteins and uh, other molecules of the immune system and different things. So swelling is bringing a lot of this blood plasma there, which has a few things that are important, and they're there for a reason. So you don't necessarily want to get rid of it right away, because it can serve a purpose, or if it goes away and comes back, that can be part of the body's healing process. But it's going to have some of the these immune system compounds that are there to actually kind of chew up the debris and clean the area
Mm,
before the body then rebuilds. And the other part of blood plasma is the proteins, the raw materials that once that debris has been sort of eaten up by these like, Pac-Man like cells in the nervous system, the proteins there can start to be laid down and build new layers and rebuild areas that have been damaged. So uh, there's one question of whether you want a ton of swelling there or not. Or sorry, there's one question of whether you want some swelling there. If there's a lot and it seems stagnant, yes, getting rid of it is good. The gravity can help. The best way to pump blood and fluids generally is movement. Muscles act as our mechanical pump. Our calf muscles are what
mm,
if they weren't working. Like if you sit on an airplane, a lot of people, even if they're healthy, get some swelling in their feet and lower legs because you're just not moving as much. So if the calf muscles are moving, they pump that fluid back up because you got to work
mm,
against gravity to get fluid from the legs back up to the heart so it can recirculate throughout the body. So movement ultimately is best. And elevation can be helpful. We typically like to do both in sessions where we'll do some therapy, try to work through the neurological protective patterns that are keeping people, preventing them from moving. It's interesting. Pain, and I will get into this more, but pain and these movement limitations, a lot of what we experience as problems are actually imposed intentionally by the brain on the body, by the nervous system on the body. And we need to figure out how to essentially work with it, figure out why that signal is being
mm.
imposed, find where it's being imposed, and work at that neurological level to affect change. And that's how you can get these amazing results where people feel better so much faster because you're sort of going to the root cause of the problem. But if you can get more movement in there, that's going to be the best thing for swelling. And then sometimes we'll have like with or without even our device on, usually with in our sessions. But and then at the end of a session, we'll have people lay down there with their legs elevated or the body part elevated, so that they will get some more fresh blood flowing there and things like that. But we typically like to do both.
Yeah. So that brings up two things for me. The first is, so I tweaked my back, not majorly, but like this minor tweak. I was doing some deadlift, and it was like a week before Marissa was going to give birth. My wife was going to give birth, so I was like, "Oh crap! I just messed up my back doing deadlift. Now I'm gonna have to deal with this while she's giving birth, and she's going to be saying like, oh my god, I'm going through birth. I'm going to be like, yeah, but like my back hurts a little bit, so what about me? And that wouldn't have been good. So I was anyway, so like I freaked out, and I contacted I'm fortunate enough to like to be able to reach out to Kelly Starrett, and he's been on the podcast, and he's been um able to help me out sometimes. So I reached out to him, and I was like, what do I do? My back. He's like, oh, just don't freak out. Here, do this. So he has me do like a little reset exercise that he's got an older model. According to my wife, he has an older model of PT, which is really hip focused when it comes to the spine. And so he had me do some basically just hip exercises to try and reset the pelvis to make it centered. And then he said, and the part that's relevant to this conversation is that he mentioned that, hey, and it's a good idea for you also to get on an ibuprofen regimen for the next few days, just to dissociate, just to try and eliminate that pain signal so that you don't establish this relationship between pain and these certain movements. And so that was and that's what I wanted to bring that up because it is understanding that pain is not just physical. It's also like when you remember that there is pain there, you create this sensation of pain, even if it might not be caused physically. And that's to say that pain goes beyond physical, and there is that brain component to it, that nervous system component to it. So I think it's cool that you brought that up. And the second thing that I thought of was just how that comparison of pain in the body is very similar to pain, uh to emotional pain and emotional discomfort, right? You've got this uncomfortable feeling for a reason, and you could either deal with it or you could do something to make it go away. So you can either make the annoyance go away, or you could understand that the annoyance is being caused by something and you can address the root cause. So it's it's just kind of cool to see that concept plays out in, in multiple areas of life. So I'll
So,
let you get back to what you were saying now.
that's a great connection, and I think it's the pain is really similar in both the experience of physical pain and also that of emotional pain, where in both cases it's literally the brain's attempt to signal us to change our behavior or to do something or not do something. But
Hmm.
if it's a fear and avoidance, it's to not do something. If it, it's the brain's attempt to get us to change our behavior, and it's more obvious in the case of, if you have just been in a traumatic accident, if you hurt your leg significantly in a car crash and you broke your femur, it's obvious that the pain there, pain in your leg, is your brain's way of saying, don't load that leg because you could hurt your femur worse. So
Hmm.
there it's an obvious one-to-one correlation between damage and pain.
Yeah.
And
So that brings up a good question that we could explore. When is it appropriate to try and numb the pain versus when is it not as appropriate to try and numb the pain?
that's a really good question too. So I think that there's a difference between relying on ice or painkillers or anti-inflammatories to as a long-term strategy versus, like you were talking about with Kelly Starrett, as a short-term part of your intervention in order to break some of this association. So generally I'm on the side of, we want to experience pain because it's a signal, and if we're just
Mm.
numbing it or masking it, it is like, I do really believe in that metaphor. It's like if there's a fire in the house and the fire alarm's going off, it's sort of like just letting the fire still rage, but just silencing the alarm. It's the pain is trying to tell you something, and generally speaking, if your only strategy is to just turn off that signal, you're not only not fixing the problem, but the problem could continue to get worse because you're
Hmm.
not even aware of it. Like, you could have a little bit of damage and not know that it's there because of pain, because the pain isn't telling you, and you could continue to make it worse, make it worse, make it worse. So it's going to get to the point where you might have been able, had you intervened then, been able to still salvage something, some better result. But now it gets past the point of no return, where you're going to need a surgery or some more significant intervention, whatever it
Mm.
might be. So, I do believe it's a signal, and outside of short-term strategic intervention like you described, where it's part of an approach where you also are working on the root cause. Outside of that, I'm generally not as big of a fan of strategies just to block and treat pain. Uh,
Okay.
there, it's really interesting where, sorry, just to block or numb pain, to actually treat it. If we understand this notion, if we can just carry this forward a little bit here, we get some insights into how we can treat it. Where we know this type of scenario where someone has a broken femur and their that leg hurts, and that's the brain's way of saying, hey, don't load that leg. That's kind of obvious.
Hmm.
The problem with thinking about examples like that is then we always start to assume that there's a one-to-one correlation between physical damage and pain. And one of the biggest breakthroughs in pain science in the last 20 to 30 years is that we now know that pain is an output signal from the brain, and it may or may not be related to physical damage in the body. It could be a response to psychological pain. It could be a response to your liver having difficulty processing alcohol, which
Mm.
leads to pain in the right shoulder sometimes. It could be
Yeah, like my wife's mother had lung cancer, and she eventually passed away from that. But she was saying, I think left shoulder is related to lungs, or right shoulder. I forgot, but yeah, there's um, different locations of the body are connected to different parts of the body, which is a really interesting concept.
and that's part of why, if you are having pain, you do want to see a professional, like your wife, who's a bona fide doctor of physical therapy or something like that. Because if you just just work on it with, a trainer or some, self myofascial release stuff at home or something like that.
Yeah, some dumb yoga instructor.
If it doesn't, well, if it does go away and get better quickly, then it's probably musculoskeletal. But if it
Mm,
lingers, you want to get it checked on, because those cases are rare, but sometimes it is a cancer. Sometimes it is, cancer in a lung or in your bones or something like that, where you hear about these
mm.
situations, and people who are trained to identify. I just want to mention that, because yes, they're rare, but gosh, if you want to catch those, if as soon
Mhm.
as you can. So back to this conversation about pain here.
Also, I just want to say, like, if you have lingering pain, it doesn't mean necessarily that you have cancer. There also is a thing of chronic pain. We are going to talk about that too. So
Yes,
don't jump straight to I have cancer.
good, fair point. Great point. Yes, it's not intending to scare anybody. Uh,
Yeah.
so um, so there's this phenomenon then where that bone in this example can heal, and yet the person is still locked in this cycle of chronic pain. They still have pain for months or years
Mm,
after that happens. And so the question there is why. If obviously the pain is not coming from the leg because the leg is healed, the pain is in the brain, and the brain still perceives a need
mm,
to protect that area. It still perceives a need to signal the person to not use that leg. And so it could be because you never fully rehabilitated muscle function or proprioception, your ability to sense where that leg is in space. So sometimes, in this example, sometimes if your brain can't sense where your leg is in space, it will actually trigger pain as a way of limiting your movement there, because the brain's, proprioception is this word that a lot of your listeners, I'm sure, will know, where it's sort of how our brain can see the body in space. So it's sort of like if you're walking around a room with an obstacle, with obstacles on the floor, you can easily navigate around it when your eyes are open. That's like having good proprioception. But if your eyes are closed, your movement is you're gonna be a lot more guarded. As you're walking around the room, you're gonna
mm,
be kind of taking smaller steps, really, really guarded. That's sort of how your proprioception is. If your brain can't see where that limb is, it's gonna want to confine your movement more and more and more, so that because it can't see if you're going to run into obstacles or hurt yourself.
mm.
So it's going to try to limit that as a protective mechanism, and pain is one way of imposing that limitation on the body.
So pain in a lot of so in this description, there is a type of pain where it is a protective measure. So it's not actually being caused by anything, but it's your brain's way of saying, or your body's way, or however you want to think of it. But it is your body's protective mechanism saying, "Don't do that. This might hurt," and it's causing pain in order to signal that, which is interesting. Marissa, so she'll say this because. She has been injured as an athlete, and she's worked with athletes. It's not her specialty, but she has worked with athletes. But one thing that she does say, like, to me, when I was playing lacrosse, still I haven't played lacrosse in a few years, I've decided that being able to create workouts is more important than being able to go play lacrosse on the weekends. So I've opted out of that largely. But she mentions that if I, when I was going out and playing, to make sure that I go out and I play hard. Like, go out and don't think about if you have, something to guard, or some sort of injury or some sort of pain that you're guarding, because you're more likely to get injured there. If you're not going out and playing all the way, if you're only going in and, half-assing it, then there's a higher risk of injury because you're being protective. Is that something that you've experienced, that you talk to people about?
Yes, that's a great insight. And I would say yes. And the only thing I would add is just a little bit of elaboration and say it's because in order to protect yourself from injury, you need your muscles to be working to their maximal ability. Think about them
Mm,
as shock absorbers. They're, when you're, especially, when you're running, especially when you're cutting, decelerating, those forces can be 5 to 8 times your body weight worth of force on one leg as you're cutting aggressively or when you're sprinting down the field. So there's you know hundreds or even 1,000 or more pounds of force in fractions of a second that
mm,
your muscles have to contend with. And if your muscles don't absorb those forces, they're going to go into your meniscus or ligaments, these other passive supportive structures, or they're going to work their way up the leg and go into your low back, and you're going to get a tweak up there. And so
Mm-hmm.
in order for, if you're holding back, just as you're describing, then you're going to be impeding your muscles' ability to fire in that explosive way that is required for them to protect you from the forces you encounter on the field of play. So that
Mm-hmm.
is very good advice. And yeah, I would say I totally agree. And that's part of why when you do have a tweak or something and you're compensating around it, you're more likely to get injured as well, because you could be trying to
Mm-hmm.
go hard, but if on every step you feel your ankle or you feel your knee, you're more likely to tear an Achilles or hurt something, because your muscles are not going to be, no matter how much you try, if you have that pain there, your nervous system is going to be beneath your level of consciousness, is going to be limiting muscle output there, and you're going to be more vulnerable.
Hmm. I mean, so for me, that brings up and I've, by the way, if it looks like I'm typing things, it is because I'm typing up notes as we go here. I've got all these questions that I want to ask. And for me, that brings up the question is, how do you go from injured and in pain to being able to exercise freely and without pain again? And another question that I had written down is, how do you distinguish between, I think we talked about this, but I do want to come back to this, is distinguishing, or how to address pain from different types of injuries appropriately. So, like you mentioned, if someone's in a car crash and they fracture their femur, or they have multiple splinters, or multiple parts of that bone break off and shatter, versus someone who has a meniscus injury, versus someone who, I don't know, breaks a finger. How do you approach those different types of injuries? So like a fracture is different than a, so I'm thinking about it from my perspective. If let's say I'm a runner and I have a stress fracture in my foot. Let's say one of my metatarsals has a stress fracture, versus if I have a ankle sprain. So like how do you approach the pain differently there too? So those are questions that I have. I'm going to throw them out there. But if you had something that you were going into with pain uh, before, if you were building up to something, I don't want to take you away from that.
It's a good question, and we can sort of tie back in those themes too. There's the David Goggins approach of the, to heck with it, I'm just going to curse myself out and run through the pain anyway, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
then,
that's the traditional model of male improvement. I think there's a better way to be better, which involves acknowledging things instead of just pushing through everything. And
yes, well,
yeah,
and and I mean, even in his first book, he talks about when he ran through that. Then he had to take months where he couldn't run again because he needed to repair the damage. So he
oh, I didn't know about that second part. All I knew was that he just ran through and broke a bunch of bones. And okay, good to know that he actually had to recover from that. So
there were times even he had to pay some of the physical consequences, but I mean, there's certainly other value in terms of the mental toughness and everything he's cultivated. So
mhm.
not to diminish that at all. I want to
Right.
certainly acknowledge that. But when you're talking about recovering from an injury, there's two parts that you have to consider. There's we'll call them the hardware and the software. The hardware being, of course, the bone that has a stress fracture, or the ankle ligament that's been sprained, or the femur that's been broken, whatever the situation is. And then there's the software, which is the nervous system function, which is the reason that you talk about having to go out and play hard, because if your muscles aren't working as well, then you're more vulnerable and they're not turned back on. So if you go out and you try to play lacrosse again, you try to play any sport again, while you still have pain, while the tissue isn't recovered enough to be stable, doesn't meet that kind of minimum threshold, you're going to be holding yourself back. You're going to be
Hmm.
having these subconscious patterns we talked about. We're going to be limiting muscle output sort of as a protective mechanism, or muscles are going to be stiff and holding on to protect. And therefore, when they're stiff, they can't work eccentrically. They can't lengthen to accommodate movement. And perhaps then the muscles are likely to strain or tear, because if you if you are running and your hamstring is holding on to try to protect your knee, and you're running, you're kicking out fast with your quad, you're trying to pull your hamstring apart as it's holding on and bracing. Sometimes in that tug of war, one of the muscles will lose and get muscle strain and stuff like that too. So there's all these other things that can happen. Your joints will be more vulnerable to further injury. So you want to ultimately address both the hardware and the software. The really interesting insight here in our experience is that so many times when we think an ankle sprain is going to take 4 to 6 weeks to heal, the reason that it takes so long is not as much the hardware. It's because of the software. It's because of that neurological response. It's because of the guarding, the bracing, the stiffening up around it, trying to protect. So that actually is a case where the body is standing in the way of its own healing process. That response may be productive if that tissue is going to be attacked again at any moment. But if you're actually being intentional about recovering and you're safe, like intellectually that you're safe, even if your body subconsciously doesn't know, if you know that, then you want to be able to work through those protective patterns as much as possible, because that stiffness, I mean, literally it can be part of, that tension reducing the blood flow to that injured area, which is impeding the body's ability to send those inflammatory, those immune system cells and the proteins that we talked about earlier that are part of the healing process. And so working through that to restore function, it enables you to get out of your own way and allow the body's healing process to go at its natural rate. And when that happens, it seems miraculous. We're here in Texas. We see a lot of high school football players. I can't tell you how many times every fall, football players are supposed to be out for 4 weeks with an ankle sprain, and we get them back in 1 week, time and time and time again. And it's because we're able to manage the neurological response, work on the software side instead of just focusing on the hardware. Because oftentimes when you work on that software side, the hardware can heal faster, and you also complete the recovery faster because you're not left in a state where you've just waited for the tissue to heal, but in the meantime the muscles have gotten weaker, the tissues have gotten stiffer, so you have all these functional deficits when you finally get back out onto the field too. So we really like that approach.
That's awesome. That's so cool. I mean, that was really well explained too. I think people understanding that there is the physical component and the brain and the neurological component, or the brain neurological, the nervous system component too. That's really cool to understand. And so now my question is, I know that the NEUBIE is an awesome machine, and that if you are in Austin, and if you're in, where else are you, by the way? I know that you have practitioners all over the country. You have a website with, so if you are listening to this and you're like, I need this NEUBIE to help recover more quickly, if you go to neufit no, it's neu.fit, right? The website?
neufit.com. We got that domain.
neufit.com.
It does forward, but the website is neu.fit.
Okay. Yeah. So if you go there, I know that there is there's like a portion of where you can find someone who practitions in this, and you can get it close to where you are. We've actually had a few people from Be the Better You, who looked it up after you doing their demo there, and we had one guy who had actually been doing it even before that, like he already knew about it, which was pretty cool. So so if you do have the ability to do it, then obviously do that. But I'm curious, like for people who don't have that ability, then are there lessons? Is there practical information that can be taken from this understanding and applying it to their recovery that can be helpful?
Yeah, for sure. So the way I look at it is sort of like, imagine we're in, caveman days, and someone in your family or extended family gets injured, sprains their ankle.
You kill them, right? You end them off right there.
You can't. I mean, potentially, right? It's very. If they can't walk and fend for themselves, they're liable to get eaten. Or if you have to carry them, that could make everyone else more vulnerable. And so you basically have to like get up and move around. And so what we're really trying to do is, and I'll describe this because then we can learn the principles that even if people don't have access to the technology, that they can apply. But what we're really trying to do is take that sort of seemingly ruthless approach of like, okay, you got injured here, it pushed you a lot in that direction. We're going to give you enough stimulus to push you back in the other direction to restore function in a positive way. But we're able to do it in a safe way that doesn't cause you to get injured worse along the way. Because
Mm.
that's the caveat with that approach of saying like, okay, I'm limping, I need to get function back in this leg, but if I just go and use that leg and use that leg and use that leg and try to power through it, then I could injure it worse.
Yeah.
At the
And
same
that makes me think of my that makes me think of my non-compliant grandparents who, they get a surgery or they do something and they're like, "It doesn't matter. I have dinner tomorrow. I'm going and you can't stop me." So, uh to what extent that's helpful because they're going to get up and moving, but if they're pushing themselves too much, you're saying then that is detrimental.
So yes, so there's a balancing act here, and so what we're able to do with the NEUBIE for neurobioelectric stimulator and the NeuFit method is to find where the nervous system is guarding, protecting, help people move, work through that, so you can make change a lot faster. The That's the technology driven version. It's called the digital version. The analog version is to essentially try to do the same thing through movement on your own. Motion is lotion, movement is improvement. Try to do as much, it depends what the exercise would be, what the movement would be. But like you talked about, Kelly Starrett giving you some movements to do to help reset your pelvis. So what I would say is if someone doesn't have access to technology like this, try to do as much quality movement as you can without exacerbating your symptoms at all. So if someone had a lower back pain episode,
Mm.
maybe doing some lumbar circles like this. I mean, if you're just listening, you can't see, but I'm just doing a movement that's literally like a few inches with my spine, going to the pain but not through it, doing
Mm.
as much movement as I possibly can, and then try to increase that, go up to the edge of pain as that pain-free range of motion increases. Do a little more, do a little more, but you're gonna. The expectation has to be that it's gonna, in order to create change, to change this neurological pattern. You have this neurological pattern being imposed on the body that's a response. It's like an alarm response to some sort of injury or trauma. So you need a lot of input to change that. You can
Mm.
use the technology we talked about to get that barrage of input faster, or you can accumulate it over greater time. But it's going to take thousands of repetitions likely. So it might be one PT session, 45 minutes, or it might be, several hours a day of doing these movements on your own if you don't have access to technology like that. But that would be the analog or the manual version, doing as much of those exercises as you can, as much movement as you can within that range where you're not exacerbating the symptoms at all, so that again, using pain as a signal, that you're
Mm.
not harming yourself and making things worse.
Yeah. So, and this is something that my wife tells her patients all the time, and it's something that I've been fortunate to bring over into the work that I do. But do what you can without pain.
Mhm.
If it hurts, don't do it. And if you continue to focus on the things that you can do without pain, and you slowly start to expand your ability into those things, within a few weeks, maybe even within 1 week, if you have access to a newbie, then you'll go back to movements that used to cause pain and you'll realize, like, oh, this doesn't hurt anymore. That's pretty cool.
100%. Yeah. Nothing to add other than to underscore, highlight, and add an exclamation point.
Hmm. I think what's really cool about, physical therapist, and you mostly employ physical therapists at NeuFit, right?
We do, yeah. We've got a lot of
Yeah.
physical therapists, and we have some fitness trainers and people that we also can use it on that side. But yeah,
Hmm.
several PTs, and then it's most commonly used in physical therapy clinics around the country. Also, many chiropractic offices, and other different types of various boutique medical facilities, or some,
Hmm.
but mostly, yeah, mostly physical therapy and chiropractic.
Yeah. And so I bring that up because people who have this specialized knowledge they're way more knowledgeable than people who have physical people who are trainers or coaches. Not to say that those people don't have that training; they may have that training, but if you're looking for people who have the specialized knowledge that understand when you move something and it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, a physical therapist understands. A good physical therapist will understand, oh, if this causes pain here, it's because of this muscle, it's because of this dysfunction, and I know the exact exercises that you can do to fix it. So if you're looking for the quickest way to relieve pain, it is really helpful to understand. It is really helpful to work with the people who um, understand that those practices, and that's physical therapist. So
And
just want to
if I could add one comment
please
onto that,
do.
I like to think of whether you're injured or not, whether you're in pain or not, I like to think of exercise as medicine, where you want
Mm-hmm.
to make sure that you have. I mean, especially true when you're dealing with an acute injury or you're in pain or stuff like that, where it's even more important that you choose the right medicine for the disease.
Mm,
Right? You also need the right dose, the right timing, the right consistency, stuff like that. And you can have the wrong thing, or you can take too much or too little of it, and then you have a lot more latitude when you're not injured, of course. But
mm-hmm.
there's something there, and then when you're
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
and then there's also when you're not injured, then there's like the notion of kind of expand it for nutrition and supplementation. And so I think we want to expand exercise to also include moving throughout the day. Unless you're on some sort of extreme plan, just eating once a day for most people most of the time is not the best avenue for energy and vitality and things like that. So getting
Mm-hmm.
more movement in throughout the day, in addition to your man flow yoga class, or in addition to your physical therapy session,
Mm-hmm.
other things like that throughout the day. But I think some of these metaphors, thinking about how movement is part of our is a source of nutrition, I think is another helpful. Exercise is medicine and movement is nutrition. I think that's a really powerful framework, at least that helps me and seems to land with people that we talk to.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, that's definitely helpful. All right, so I want to go back to one of those questions that I had before. So it is distinguishing between things like a bone break and soft tissue injury, and how do you address recovery with those differently?
So of course, first thing you want to get evaluate if you think you're might have an acute fracture or something like that. Getting evaluated, sometimes a therapist or an athletic trainer can look at you. Sometimes you have to be referred out for imaging, but you want to be responsible and not load something if you could injure it worse just by even walking on it or something like there's caveat that we want to be responsible. But then whatever it is, whether it's a bone or it's a ligament or muscle, whatever it is, then we want to apply the same thinking here of looking at the hardware, looking at the software, looking at prioritizing as soon as we responsibly can the neurological response to that injury and working through that so that we can restore function. Because another part of that is that in addition to allowing the body's healing process, like we talked about a little bit earlier, another part of that is that by restoring function, you're turning the muscles back on to one of the themes that we talked about even before that. You're turning your muscles back on in a way where they can now support the injured area of the body as it heals, so that you are less likely to re-injure. You have these built-in you have your own natural, brace or cast or whatever the protective
Mm-hmm.
sling or sleeve, your own natural protective mechanism, and it's your muscles. So the faster you can get them working again, the more effectively they'll work to prevent that re-injury from occurring. So
Mm-hmm.
regardless of what the injury is, as fast as we responsibly can, we want to really prioritize that neurological response and restore function.
Got it. So it sounds like I might just have an incorrect assumption about like a bone injury versus a soft tissue injury. But for me, I'm thinking from personal experience. Like when I have a broken wrist feels very different than a ligament tear in a knee. Like if you've ever had a broken bone before, and if you ever want to see my cast collection, my mom has it somewhere. I think she's actually going to throw it away pretty soon, but I've got a really nice cast collection somewhere. Um, Point being that they feel really different, and having something like a torn ligament, like it feels okay to move on that, versus a bone, it doesn't. And so my assumption to this point has been that if you have, you know, um, here's a cool injury that I had when I was 12. I jumped off a flight of stairs, jumped off a flight of 12 stairs and landed on cement. And I did it once without hurting myself. I did it a second time, and I ended up breaking 3 metatarsals. And so for that, like I was in a cast for a really long time. It really hurt to walk. But like, what's the difference between, maybe I just need to, I don't know if I'm asking it a different way, or maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but
I think
what's the difference in recovery?
so. I think I sort of lumped all these together because the paradigm is the same, and I sort of glossed over some of the details. When I'm saying we want to prioritize restoring neurological function, reintroducing movement as fast as we responsibly can. The difference is that sometimes you're going to have that limb immobilized for 6 or 8 weeks, whereas in another one you can actually introduce movement right away on day one. So there is some difference in terms of the time course and what you can do. We always want to do as much of this process of restoring function as we safely can within the confines of the situation, but those confines can be vastly different depending on the circumstances. So yeah, if you are in a cast and can't move a limb, or you can't put weight on that leg for a period of time while the bones are healing, then the question is, okay, how much of this usual process can we do within these more severe limitations? And so maybe we're going to just do isometric squeezing of the muscles, or maybe we're going to put pads on, from our machine above and below the cast to get some increased blood flow in there, to get some muscle activity, so that when the cast comes off, there's not as much atrophy. So that it's still the same paradigm of wanting to, address that restoring neurological function, addressing the neurological response to injury and trauma as quickly as we can. But it's just, in some scenarios, we're going to be a lot more limited, and our expectation of the time course is going to be a lot different, because we know we're not going to be able to really do the more intense version of work for 4 or 6 or 8 weeks.
Okay. So the same advances that you're talking about, that you've been able to make with the NEUBIE, with speeding up soft tissue injuries like ankle sprains or meniscus tears, you haven't yet figured out a way to speed up a bone break from a 3-month period to 2 weeks. Is that what you're saying?
So there's we've talked about this a lot here, where there's both this hardware and software component to injury, and where we have these exciting breakthroughs are when there is some hardware damage, and that, however, is not as big of a part of the problem as more of the problem is actually in the neurological response. That's more of the cause of pain and limitation than the actual damage. There might be some damage to heal, but addressing that neurological response really speeds up the process. There you are, however, limited. The more severe the hardware damage is, the more time it's going to take to heal. And we can speed it up, maybe reduce a week or two. But if there is a fractured bone, there's a period of time that it's going to take for that bone to form the union, and the layers of bone to build back together, and all that stuff. So there is a process, and that process is limited by the hardware. There's times where we think it's a hardware injury, but it's actually more of a software injury, and that's where we get these experiences that are like, holy crap, that's insane. But then there's times where the hardware injury is more serious and is a greater percentage, greater part of the problem, and so we're going to adjust our expectations, knowing that it's going to take longer for that part to heal.
Okay, got it. Okay, all right, that makes sense to me. So for guys who are going through, or women, men or women, going through your protocols, what are some things that are there things outside of the, obviously do your PT at home, obviously do your at home physical therapy. Don't be a non-compliant patient in this case. And if you have, prescribed exercises, you should be doing those in addition to your PT visits. But aside from that, are there other things that can help, other lifestyle, or I don't know if there's a diet, nutrition, what else can you do to help speed up recovery?
This is definitely, yes, there's some things here. And this sort of gets into something you and I were talking about before we hit the record button, of there's this notion that some people believe and others resist, but this notion that we're all athletes and life is a sport, and that the things, athletes spend a lot of time very intentionally recovering because they need to replenish their energy and rebuild their bodies, between practices and games and the grueling sports season. And so there's a version of that I believe we all need in daily life. And for many people, I mean, sleep is going to be the cornerstone. If you're not sleeping well, that's sort of the first domino. Everything else is a problem. Then looking at the basics of nutrition. So I'm not saying we necessarily have to do anything super elaborate, But the things that are going to move the needle the most on recovery, let's look at sleep, for example. So if you're fatigued from a workout, or you have some micro trauma in your muscles from a workout, or if you're trying to heal a fracture or torn ligament, the greatest percentage of your actual healing and rebuilding of tissue that's going to happen throughout the day is going to be concentrated during sleep, especially during your stages of deep sleep. So you want to make sure you're going to bed early enough so that your circadian rhythm is aligned to where you're going to get deep sleep. You want to make sure you have adequate protein on board, so you have the raw materials to rebuild and repair tissues. You want to make sure that the quality of that sleep is going to be as good as it possibly can be. REM sleep also is another very important phase of sleep, and that's when we do a lot of the neurological remodeling to incorporate whatever we've learned during the day. So incorporating learning, synthesizing memories. These when we talk
Have you
about
read Why We Sleep?
yeah, Matthew Walker, yeah, great book.
Awesome book. Awesome book. So yeah, if you want to go deeper into this, not that you can't speak to it, but if you're listening to this and you're like, I want to learn more about why sleep is good for me, or if you're just not convinced that sleep is that important, Matthew Walker, Why We Sleep, life-changing book. Definitely get it.
Yes, 100%. So the things that are going to move the needle the most outside of PT are going to be, I would say, sleep, nutrition, movement. For sleep, a big one that's made a huge difference for me and many others is aligning with circadian rhythms. People talk about like seeing morning sunlight, or I often get up before the sun, so I have a big red light panel. I go stand and I do some work or reading in front of that in the morning, just to make sure that it's sort of like the equivalent. The sunrise is red, right? So telling my brain like, hey, it's morning time. Let's set this cycle that's going to have me ready to fall asleep properly 16 hours later at the end of the day. So that can be a huge influence. The timing of food and light exposure are super relevant. And then other movement too. There's this concept of energy flux that's a really, really valuable tool to think about. So you could have, for example, if you're trying to, and we can tie this into injury recovery and stuff like that soon, but if you're trying to lose 10 pounds, say, and you're trying to have a 500 calorie deficit every day, there's a huge difference between eating 1,500 calories and burning 2,000 calories in a day. Huge difference between that and eating 3,500 calories and burning off 4,000 calories in a day. Even though both have the same 500 calorie deficit, there's a huge difference between them, because when you have more energy flux or more energy activity there, your metabolism is going to be higher. You're going to have less of a sense of hunger. All the systems of your body, your mitochondria, are going to be working better to make more energy. And what does it take to repair from injury? To repair tissue, recover from injury, it takes energy. You have to have enough energy to meet your basic survival needs, and then have a surplus left over to rebuild and repair tissue. So the way to increase that energy flux is more movement during the day, and then of course eating more, because we talked about at the beginning the signal of if you're resting, your signal is basically to downregulate energy production. If you're moving, signal is to upregulate energy production. Same thing. If you're not eating food, if you're fasting, there are benefits to occasional fasting, yes, but if you're generally not eating enough food, the signal is to downregulate your metabolism, to put the body into a state of famine, or a state of conservation, for concern that we might be in the middle of a famine right now, right? So we need to downregulate. We need to ramp up energy production for healing and repair. So just a few things there that I think are going to be the biggest movers of the needle. But sleep, nutrition, movement throughout the day, as much as you can do without safely, without re-injuring yourself.
So when you say nutrition, what aspects of nutrition?
Definitely protein. So especially when you're trying to recover from an injury, an extra serving or two, we tell people an extra serving or two of protein a day. General guidelines. I mean, people have different paradigms. I think we can all agree on, eating more whole foods, a lot of healthy plant foods. I'm a fan of animal protein, especially when trying to recover from injury or heavy workouts. But I care a lot about the quality. I'm a big believer in grass-fed beef and how it actually is good for the planet, and regenerative agriculture. Don't like the traditional confined feedlot animals and stuff like that. But I would say, really emphasize as much protein as you can eat, because you'll you'll get a greater sense of satiety, and you want a lot of that protein on board, especially when you're trying to repair tissues, and then challenge yourself to double or triple beyond what you would normally eat. The number of plant foods. So you get the fibers, you get the polyphenols, you get all these things. You feed your gut bacteria. Um, you need some carbs and fat to give yourself energy as well. So in this state, it's not if you're trying to recover from injury or trying to build tissue, it's not the time to be dieting down.
Hmm. Okay. All right. That's helpful. So here's a question that I thought of that I get all the time, and I would love your response on this. But trying to gauge what is an acceptable amount of discomfort or pain versus, so the questions that I get, I think people confuse soreness with pain, and I think people don't know the line between discomfort and pain. And I'm just wondering, what would be your thoughts on being able to interpret the delineations of those different categories?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple parts that, I mean, one is you'll certainly know afterwards when the exercise is done based on if you feel better or worse once you've kind
And
of.
how long afterwards?
Well, it depends what you're talking. I mean, if you're talking about muscle soreness, you could have muscle soreness for 2 or 3 days after exercise, and that can be okay. You don't necessarily need to be sore, so it's not like getting sore itself is the goal. Your goal is the goal, whether it's increasing mobility or strength or the ability to perform a certain skill. If you have some soreness along the way, the key to look at is the soreness in the muscle that I was trying to target, and is it reasonable, or is it achy in a joint? That's
Mm,
a problem. If your muscle is sore 2 or 3 days after, but your joints feel loose and good, that's fine. If you feel achy in a joint or in a tendon, that's where you don't want to feel that there. So that's the first question: is sort of where do you feel it, either acutely or
mm,
you're sore a few days after. Uh, Generally, if you during an exercise, also if you feel burning in the belly of your muscle, like people think of as lactic acid, or the presence of hydrogen ions are there. If you feel that burning in a muscle, that generally is productive. And if you feel your lungs really working well, that generally is productive. But if you feel something in a joint or connective tissue, that is generally more of an alarm. So I'd say the first thing
mm,
is look at where one is feeling that. Um, and then I think some of it comes from experience. But if people are really concerned and having that question, um, I think one thing to do is to actually, if you're concerned, like, am I hurting myself worse? As soon as you have that concern, if it makes sense, stop, sort of rest for a moment or a few minutes until the sensation goes away, and then see can you do that movement without pain? Because if you've sort of kind of testing your own hypothesis, like you have a hypothesis, this might be hurting me. So if so, then in a few minutes it's probably still going to be or in a moment later it's probably going to be aggravated and hurt worse if you try to do that same movement. Whereas if you're actually having the productive type of discomfort, challenging your muscles, working through these neurological limitations to come out stronger on the other side, then a moment later when you go to that movement, it should feel lighter, crisper, easier, less painful, etc. So I think you can sort of
mm.
play detective and test your own hypothesis there to figure it out.
Hmm. Okay. Got it. Yeah, I think what you're hinting at here is there could be fatigue. It could just be tired in the moment, and your technique has started to get a little worse. So if you take that time to give yourself some just a little time to reset and kind of recover and refocus on the proper technique, then then that pain might go away because you're using proper technique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So now another thing that I'm thinking is I forgot it, but I'm gonna remember it in a second, and then I'll be able to ask it. We'll cut this part out. I'm trying to remember what I was asking about, or we won't cut it out. I don't know. Depends on if Edward catches it or not. Um, Oh, I wanted to talk about muscle activation. And so there's this concept of so muscle activation has been I think a big, I don't know if you call it a buzz term or whatever, but muscle activation is really big with what I do with manful yoga. And it's something that I really focus on in the workouts. And there's there's some different, I don't know if to describe it as competing schools of thought. But there are some people who say that training muscle activation is good, and there are some people who say that training it is bad because it develops this unnatural sort of muscle engagement where you should be focusing on, instead of saying work on squeezing your glutes, you should just be doing a hip extension. You should just be doing a movement that automatically causes the glutes to fire. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to what makes muscle activation training effective or not effective.
That that's a good question. The sort of approach I like to take here is to think of movement literacy the same way as we would about literacy with language. We want to first learn the alphabet, which would sort of be the equivalent of doing muscle isolation exercises. And then we want to learn to string those letters together into words and then sentences and paragraphs, etc. And so I think there's certainly value in, we need to learn to be able to speak in full sentences, right? And we need to be able to communicate in that way. And so we need
Mm.
to be able to do compound movements and have the right letters or the right muscles engaging in those movements, right? So everything works harmoniously and in a coordinated fashion. And there's also times where we have to regress and sort of build the basic building blocks. So sometimes that means isolation exercises of certain muscles. I would particularly emphasize using muscles at their shortest range of motion where you really have to activate. So for the bicep, for example, a lot of people just do bicep curls with their arm at their side here, but doing a bicep curl here where you're in both. So if you can't see, if you're just listening, I have my arm up overhead. I'm flexing, I'm raising my arm and then bending my elbow. So I'm really working that bicep in the short range of motion. So working that muscle in a position where it actually wants to cramp, where you're
Mm.
because when the muscle is at its shortest length, you need to send the greatest signal from your brain downwards to engage that muscle. So doing some repetitions there at that shortest range, I think are very good. And that's the equivalent of learning the letters. And then you can string that together. So for your glute, it might be lying face down, lifting your leg and really squeezing that glute in isolation, and then going to the glute bridge so that you've activated, you've woken up that glute, and now you're more likely to incorporate it into that multi-joint, more complex movement.
I haven't heard that before. The emphasizing muscle activation at the shortest range of motion.
Mhm.
That's really cool. And then it's good to know about the cramping because so many people, and I always tell people like, no, cramping's part of it. It's just you're getting stronger.
Mhm.
But so now we can tell people like, you're really getting stronger. This is exactly what you want to. This is exactly what you want to be feeling. So what's happening when when you're experiencing a cramp? What's happening?
So it's your muscle is sending your muscle is or sorry, your nervous system is able to send to your muscles two signals. One is to contract and one is to relax. And you're basically getting a bombardment of contract signals and not any relax signals to counter that. So uh, when you're in your when you're in your shortest length, you tend to get more cramping there because you have to send such a strong signal and everything is focused on maximally shortening there. There's no relaxed signal to counter it. Whereas when you're at more neutral muscle lengths, you have the opposing muscle contracting, so you have this more balanced set of contract and relax signals.
Hmm. Cool. All right. I'm
And
excited to know that.
and there's a interesting phenomenon. I think it is productive. I mean, it can be uncomfortable and scary when you go into that cramp, but working through that, just like I would coach people. Okay, if you're in this position where you're going to get a muscle cramp, trying to go there, just feel that cramp for 2 or 3 seconds, and then get out of it and chill out, and then go and feel
Mm.
it for 5 or 6 seconds. And eventually, over time, you'll get to the point where you'll get into these same positions, and you'll have better control, and the cramp will minimize or go away altogether.
How long does it take to go away in your experience?
Depending on the level of athlete and level of preparation and proficiency, it could be anywhere from a few weeks to several months. Uh,
Hmm.
depending on the training history.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think we typically see those cramps go away if you're being consistent. And by consistent, I mean 3 times per week. It usually takes 2, 3, 4 months.
Yeah.
But people doing manful yoga. So if you're listening to this and you've got cramps, um, we get a lot of foot cramps, a lot of foot cramps, a lot of hamstring cramps. That's where, and a lot of the hip flexor cramps too, because we do a lot of seated leg raises,
Hmm.
and yeah, that's cramp city.
There's one
So,
one other point to this. So what I was talking about there was if you're contracting your muscle, it's actively cramping, but then you relax and the cramp goes away. Sometimes people are going about their day later on, and the muscle cramps or you know people listening, if you have the experience of like you're in bed at night and something cramps up and it's like, oh shit, so those
mm,
those are those are a little bit different. I mean, we don't want those. I'm not saying we should go into that type of cramp, and that often has to do with, well, there's this really interesting phenomenon where it actually, muscles work with these fibers that overlap and kind of ratchet and pull on each other. And there's an interesting thing where you actually get it takes multiple ratchets, for lack of a better term, to contract for a full muscle contraction. But you actually, once they attach, you get the first one for free. It actually takes energy, takes ATP to break the connection between them to ratchet on to the next point and then pull again and pull again. So if you think about it, it actually takes energy to relax muscle, which is counterintuitive.
hmm,
But if you think about it, the extreme example is think about a corpse. Think about a body of someone who has recently died. What happens? Their muscles don't just go limp and flaccid, right? They get rigor mortis. They stiffen up because they no longer are making ATP. They're no longer making the energy that they need to actually relax their muscles. So it's a higher energy state to have relaxed muscles because they're primed and ready to go. They're more supple. They're more prepared to make that next contraction when needed. If they're already stiff and tight, they're actually less prepared to make that next contraction. So the interesting thing there is that the more fatigued we are and the less we are at regenerating and replenishing our energy supply, the more apt we are to get those types of cramps, in other times during the day. So different category of cramping there, but that's an interesting paradigm. So I thought it was worth mentioning.
yeah, that reminds me. Yeah, so that makes me think of. So, are there things that people can do to help with that? I mean, it sounds like eating enough and is one part of it. So like something that we recommend is, if that does happen, we say, okay, well, you want to make sure you're hydrated, right? That's usually the first thing. And then the other thing that I don't know if this has actually been proven by a study, but magnesium supplements is something that some people have anecdotally reported can help. Do you have anything to say about that?
Yeah, so magnesium and calcium are the two biggest minerals involved in muscle contraction and relaxation. So calcium triggers contraction, magnesium triggers relaxation between contractions. So yes, magnesium can be helpful, as well as generally things you can do to increase energy production. And then some of it is just sort of the breaking in period to a new training cycle where you're just having
Mm,
having trouble probably keeping up with the energy demands and recovering. But if you continue to send that signal, your body will upregulate and adapt, and you'll get better at it over time. So some of it is just recognizing that it's that sort of breaking in period. But yeah, all those things can help.
yeah.
There are some studies that show pickle juice can help with those types of cramps too. That's one
Pickle
that is
juice.
one that is proven. I forget what the chemical compound is in there, but there's something in pickle juice that actually helps with
Okay.
that. Yeah.
All right. Good to know. So you could take a magnesium supplement, but it's been proven that pickle juice has
If
been
you
helpful. So
drink down your magnesium capsule with some pickle juice, and you got all your bases covered.
wow. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Um, and then I wanted to ask one more big question that I had on here, and I think this is going to resonate with a lot of guys listening. But for guys who are older, who have had chronic pain for a long time, do these same principles that we're discussing, do these apply? Is there something that these guys should know about? So, if you're an office worker and you've had low back pain for years, if you have maybe you got shoulder surgery or had a shoulder injury when you were in your 30s or 40s and you're still having issues with that shoulder pain years later, how does what we're talking about apply to those guys who have had chronic pain? And maybe you can define chronic pain for us too, because I think people might not know what chronic pain actually means.
Yes, there's a few really good topics here. So, chronic pain is pain that lingers, consistently or continuously. There's a textbook definition um, for some period of time. Uh, I don't recall whether it's 6 weeks or 3 months, but there's some period of time where if you have consistent pain, in the same place, same quality for same or similar quality for a period of time, it crosses that threshold, becomes chronic pain, whatever the time is. But um, for for it's actually plays back into our muscle activation discussion also, and we'll tie into chronic pain here too. So one of the other things you can do for muscle activation, we talked about contracting your muscles at their shortest range. One reason that muscles will be inhibited or not activated, turned off instead of turned on, is because of joint vulnerability or joint malpositioning. So if your joints are kind of, if they should be, it's called centrated. If they should be balanced, but they're off a little bit, your nervous system is going to naturally turn off muscles because it doesn't want you to move fast or powerfully around a compromised joint because you could get hurt. And so joint mobility drills, movements, exercises can also be very good for muscle activation. And those can also be very powerful ways to help people in chronic pain here too, to kind of close the loop or connect the dots where when people have uh, chronic pain, long after any sort of original injury or something like that, there's a whole lot of factors to consider here. Some of the things we talked about earlier, it could be a deficit in proprioception where the brain just doesn't see the body enough. And so movement, especially movement of the joints, joint mobility, can be helpful for many people because the joints are so neurologically rich. They're the most vulnerable, injury prone, areas of the musculoskeletal system. There's a lot of nerves there. So when you move your joints, you end up getting a lot of neurological input, which can be very powerful and very beneficial because more input generally tells the brain like, okay, I can see where things are. So the environment, daily life feels less threatening. So that's
Hmm.
one avenue there, one point of connection.
And just to clarify, so joint movement is different than flexibility work. So if I think of stretching, if you think of flexibility as a muscle's ability to stretch, joint movement is how would you describe joint movement or joint mobility?
So they're related because your muscles have to lengthen for your joints to move, but it's sort of a different point of emphasis. Like just because it's on camera, I'll look at my elbow here. So
Hmm.
your elbow, a lot of times people would do like bicep curls or maybe kind of stretch the bicep here like this. But if you really want to maximize the neurological activation of the mechanoreceptors, the joint sensors in your elbow joint, instead of just doing bicep curls, you'd want to think a little differently. You'd want to try to do more circumduction. So I'm going to do a movement. If you're just listening, you're not watching. It'd be sort of like swinging a lasso or something in a rodeo.
Hmm.
I'll be doing more circumduction. So I'm going to get full flexion, but I'm also going to get some rotational movement, full extension, but also rotation there. So it's going to be a little bit of a different point of emphasis to really train the joints versus the muscles. And there's overlap because you can't move one without the other and vice versa. But you're going to end up emphasizing different positions, different movement patterns, things like that.
Hmm. Cool. All right. So back to the chronic pain thing.
So chronic pain. So pain. I'll say it a little bit differently. I know we talked about it a little bit already, but so pain is the brain's way of trying to get you to change something, to do something or not do something. And so we wanted to try to figure out what it is. So sometimes chronic pain is from inflammation, something biochemical going on in your gut. Inflammation, chronic inflammation can be a problem that throws things off and can lead to all sorts of different health challenges. And so sometimes it's something in the functional medicine domain. Sometimes if it's you want to try to distinguish probably, is it musculoskeletal or could it be something else? So if it's musculoskeletal, is there any movement that repeatedly causes this pain, and is it in a joint, is it more clearly mechanical, or does it ebb and flow? Does it hurt some days and not on others? Could there be more of a lifestyle emphasis? Because if you think about this, if pain is the brain's way of responding to something that's threatening, think about if you're at risk of losing your job. Think about like
Hmm.
your boss got mad at you, you're under a deadline, you're concerned about your job. To your brain, job means survival. It means the ability to get a paycheck, to pay rent, to put food on the table. So it's really threatening if you're concerned about the possibility of losing your job. And yet you don't have a I'm at risk of losing my job muscle for your brain to make hurt. And
Hmm.
so if your brain is concerned and wants to get you to do something to make a change, it's not going to invest the energy and resources to build a new pain pathway. It's going to use a well-rehearsed existing pain pathway. And so it's going to
Hmm.
wherever you tend to have chronic pain, people who have pain, it typically will tend to be in the same place over and over again. So your brain's going to use that pathway to tell you that it's time to make a change and do something different, even if it's not physical. It's going to use that same physical pain pathway. And so sometimes it could be not getting enough sleep. It could be relationship stress or job stress or other eating an offending food or something like that. And that's why sometimes that chronic pain can ebb and flow. And so getting a sense of what the triggers are, is it purely mechanical? Is it in the realm of physical therapy? Or is it, gosh, it only hurts Saturday morning after I go out and I have a bunch of fried food and drink 8 beers, with my buddies at the bar, to blow off steam on Friday night. Like, is there a pattern there? So
Hmm.
there's going to be a different recommendation depending on what the underlying causes are. And I think it's possible to at least do some self-detective work or form a hypothesis as to what the causes might be. And, like we talked about earlier, it often may involve consulting a professional for sure.
Hmm. Okay, yeah, that's good to know. I personally noticed, yeah. So I'll have pain that I don't normally have if I have some sort of highly inflammatory food. So if I have I think I've had fried chicken twice in the last 6 months or something like that, and it's not because I'm trying to say look how healthy I am. I feel better when I have healthy food, so I do that. But I know that I had some fried chicken in the last few months, and that evening and maybe the following morning I was like, why do my joints hurt? This is weird.
Mm.
So
I, I was
so
just at
going back.
I was just at a conference literally last weekend, and with a guy who's the head of physical therapy for this big organization there, and we've been talking to him, into the NEUBIE and everything. So he said, "All right, I finally have something for you to treat." He said, my back's bothering me. I've had this back pain off and on, throughout my life, but I literally hasn't bothered me for the last 6 months because I've been on a carnivore diet, which I'm not necessarily advocating for here. This is just his story. I've been on a carnivore diet. I haven't had any alcohol for 6 months, and then last night, at this conference, I had a few beers, ate a few other things. He said, and my back's really aching this morning. So we did a treatment at the booth, 5 or 10 minutes, got him feeling better. His back was feeling good. And we said, okay, you had some inflammation there. That was causing you pain and it was affecting how your muscles were moving as a compensatory response. And then we worked through that. So now it's okay. We sort of hit the reset button and you can go back to, your carnivore diet, avoiding alcohol, and you probably feel good, for a while. Or if you go back and kind of light that fire again and have more drinks tonight or something like that, we'll probably see you back here tomorrow and have to go through that process and hit the reset button again.
Hmm. Yeah, makes sense. So I don't know if you addressed this in the question. I'm gonna ask it again. So for guys who have been experiencing chronic pain for a long time, is there any difference between what they should be doing and the things that we talked about here?
Um, you might have, I mean, if it's 6 years instead of 6 months or something, you probably have a greater body of evidence that will give us more clues about what it is. So
Hmm.
hopefully you can have some more clear insights into what the cause is and therefore how to address it. But the approach is essentially the same. The pain is still pain, and it's still, this all this pain science that we've been discussing still applies. It's still an active output signal created by the brain in response to a perceived threat, and we want to figure out what that threat is, whether it's physical, musculoskeletal, or whether it's psychological, life circumstances, something that quote unquote should not hurt physically, but yet does contribute to physical pain. Um, I think the same thinking still applies, whether it's 6 weeks, 6 months, or 6 years.
Hmm. Yeah. So I guess what I'm thinking of is and one thing I'm thinking of is if someone has had that deeply ingrained sense of this causes pain in their brain for, years and years and years, is it harder to fix than somebody who's like, oh, I've only had this pain for 2 weeks, and I think if I keep doing my physical therapy, it'll go away, versus someone who's like, I tried physical therapy, it doesn't work. Now I'm doing yoga and it still hurts. Like, is this ever going to go away?
It
Because I'm trying to
is.
think of, like, is that a component?
It's harder to fix for a couple reasons. One is, think about trying to break a habit that you've had for a long time versus something you just started doing yesterday. I mean, some of it is habituation, patterns of activity within the nervous system, and how those pathways can just it can be more difficult to change after a period of time. There's also a part of that where physiologically, so there's different types of nerve fibers, different types of nerves that report from the body up to the brain, report what's happening. And when you have pain for longer periods of time, you actually end up creating more what's called C fibers, which are nociceptors. We can call them pain receptors. They're really nociceptors, perceptions of threat, because pain is in the brain. But in common parlance, people call them pain receptors. You actually will build up more and more of those the longer and longer you're in pain. So you actually do adjust into a mode where you're going to be reporting more and more of that threat to the brain. So it's easier to get locked in a cycle of chronic pain. And so it makes getting out of pain a steeper and steeper uphill battle. So instead of walking up a small hill, now maybe you have to, it's more like the equivalent of climbing a mountain. So generally, most people, most of the time it can still be done, but yes, it is going to be harder. That is a good point. So the longer it's been around, many times we would want to adjust our time expectations that it will take longer to address, but the same paradigm and the same strategies would apply.
Yeah. It's so cool understanding all this stuff about pain. It reminds me of my previous paradigm about wellness. That was, if you just worked out and ate well and slept well, that you'd be fine and you live forever, versus understanding all the things that I do now, and the much greater emphasis on emotional well-being and your relationship quality, and all that kind of stuff. And so pain is not just physical. There's so much more going on there that I think that'll be really helpful for guys. All right, so we haven't actually gone too far into getting to know the real Garrett. So this will be your chance to show yourself, so to speak. So at the end of the section one, I've got a really quick part two rapid fire questions that really pertain to the focus of this podcast. Pain, obviously, being something that most guys who are listening to this probably have experienced physical pain from injuries before, so I'm sure that's helpful. But getting into the greater focus of this podcast, I'm going to ask you some other questions, unrelated. You ready?
Let's go.
Okay, cool. What do you think is one habit, belief, or mindset that has helped you the most in terms of your overall happiness?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I mean, I would say the health, many of the practices that we've been talking about here, because I do find that when I am healthy and have more energy, I feel better. I have I have the energy to do the things that I know I should do. So sometimes I do think that health is the limiting factor in other areas that don't seem to be related to health. It's like, well, why don't you just study for the test? Or why don't you just call your mother? Or why don't you just have more compassion in that exchange with your spouse? Sometimes it's well, shit, I'm exhausted. I can't do it. I just don't have the bandwidth for it. So,
Hmm.
so I do think that focusing on energy and having enough energy is sort of the foundation for other practices. Um, but then in terms of mindset, we've already talked about some of that. So for something new, I would say, really having as much as I can. I've finally read the book Mindset, so to have the term growth mindset. But even before knowing that, just trying to see adversity as a learning opportunity, trying to see challenges as opportunities to improve, understanding that you know no one no one gets strong by carrying small burdens, right? It's like we want strength, but don't want to have to carry large burdens, or we want patience, but don't want to have to wait for it. It's like, no, those are the experiences that cultivate those qualities. And so
Hmm.
understanding that really prioritizing growth and understanding that when adversity happens, it's an opportunity to grow and learn.
Yeah. What's one thing you do for your health that you think is overlooked or undervalued by others?
We talked about sleep. I mean, I would say prioritizing sleep maybe is appropriately valued by others, at least now after we talked about it. But uh,
Yeah.
using my red light panel in the morning, I think, is a big
Mm.
one because of that. Like we talked about, it sets up that circadian rhythm for the day. So I will often read or do some work, do some texts and emails on my phone, or if I'm working on a project, try to bring my laptop over there in front of it and just be in front of that thing in the morning. And I feel like that really makes a big difference.
Mm.
Really, really gives me energy and helps with a lot of things.
I've had some requests for red light therapy topics on the podcast, so I'm gonna have to start experimenting with this again. I
Use
had it once, and I don't think I used it. I had some foot pain, so I shined the red light on my foot for like 15 minutes a few times a week, and it didn't make the pain go away. So I was like, red light's dumb, but maybe I got to try it in a different application.
there's a guy that wrote like you talked about Why We Sleep and Matt Walker's book. There's a guy
Yeah,
who wrote what I would say is the book on red light, named Ari Whitten. He'd be a good guy to have on his book. I forget.
Ari, what?
Ari Whitten,
Witten.
Whitten.
Okay.
Really good book on red light. But the biggest known mechanisms are related to, literally, red light stimulates mitochondria to produce energy, and it also reduces inflammation. So it can have these far-reaching effects. I mean, obviously disappointing it didn't work on your foot, but I use it for more systemic applications like that. I think it use that in the morning, helps a lot. And then I certainly use the NEUBIE for exercise a few times a week to
Yeah.
not to do a shameless plug of my own thing, but that being able to
Hey, as
really.
soon as I asked you guys for one. I mean, as soon as that, I won't say anything. I don't know if I'm allowed to, but hopefully there will be some ways that it's a more democratized, available technology from you guys soon. I'm looking forward to that if it happens or it doesn't happen. I don't know. All right.
Always working on it.
Yeah. What's the most important activity you regularly do for your overall stress management?
I would say exercise. I really do feel, and of course, when I'm exercising, I'm working on mobility and strength and endurance and focus and mental engagement all at the same time. But I really do feel like when I the few days a week when I push myself harder, I feel like, gosh, if I can get that was hard. If I can get through that, like, I build up sort of that sense of confidence and resolve and fortitude that I can get through the other stuff.
Hmm. Yeah. What's the most stressful part of your day-to-day life?
Um, that depends on the day, but generally, I'd say balancing the demands of business and family, and running a company with 30 something people, and trying to balance that with being a husband and a father, and although just really really having to prioritize and try to fit it all in.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest challenge facing men and their well-being today?
Ooh, that's a good question. Um, I I don't know that. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, I don't know, I think it's not specific to men, but I would just say how our society is really set up against health and vitality. I mean, if you look at
Mm-hmm.
from food choices to the amount of time we're encouraged to spend in environments with artificial light, divorced from nature. I think that kind of the the separation from nature is, if I had to pick like a core fundamental underlying root cause of a lot of issues, because that's sort of all encompassing. That speaks to food, it speaks to screen time, it speaks to um, not having to contend with changes in temperature and other environmental stressors and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're right. That's a solid answer. All right, Garrett. Where can people find out about more about NeuFit? See if they have a practitioner in their area, or you have a book too. So what are some ways people can keep up with you or learn more about NeuFit, especially when they get injured?
Yes. So if you're interested in checking it out, the website, www.neu.fit, Neu, like neurological, .fit. And then there's a for patients link where you can search our database. There's, at this time of this recording, several hundreds of clinics in the US and then a few coming online in other countries that are offering this. And it's a great place to, experiencing it is a great place to start. If you're the learning type, you want to learn more about it, thank you for mentioning my book. It's called The NeuFit Method. It's available on Amazon, hardcover, paperback, and audiobook. I was in the studio last summer recording the audiobook version, which was a cool experience, by the way. And then in terms of social media, we're most active on Instagram. We have a company page called NeuFit RFP for Rehab Fitness and Performance. And then I just started a personal one this year.
Nice.
Literally like a month ago, I just started a personal one. I've been using the business one as my, also quasi personal one for the last several years, but it's my first and last name, Garrett Salpeter.
Cool. And I feel like I would be remiss not to mention this, but Garrett's worked with a lot of really famous athletes. The Undertaker. Are you serious? Like The Undertaker, Mark Henry, right? Am I correct? I think it's Mark.
Yeah.
I know Mark Henry's. And who else have you been able to work with?
So we've got at this point, we certainly work with a lot of athletes, and then there's a lot of pro athletes, that come here and see us, or go to our network of practitioners around the country. So there's hundreds and hundreds of pro athletes receiving care or receiving treatment with the NeuBie. We've got a lot of teams. We just crossed over half of Major League Baseball now. It's 15 or 16 out of 30 teams now have the device. So we work a lot with them. But in terms of athletes, a lot of people know Saquon Barkley, the NFL running back. We helped him recover from his ACL surgery when his progress had stalled. And so I actually got to go to his house and record a video of us working together. And we did an interview with him, and we got, he was very gracious and shared his story with everybody. We've got, and if anyone's into hockey, which I am, Brent Burns is a great guy. A lot of people know him for his really long beard, but he won the Norris Trophy as the best defenseman. He's been in the NHL for 18 or 19 seasons now. And he, talks about how the NeuBie helps him with mobility, working through injuries and stuff like that. And he's been very durable and credits the NeuBie with helping him a lot for the last several years. We got some videos with him, and he wrote an endorsement of my book also. There's, a couple of Major League Baseball pitchers we have videos with and stuff as well. And, a lot of different athletes are using it for sure.
That's cool. Yeah. And one more to mention, I think I've saw a video of Mike Tyson using it.
That's right. Mike Tyson. Yeah. I gotta mention Mike. So he used it. So he had been in chronic pain for like a decade, and, people saw he had, he gained a lot of weight, and it's part of how he got into, medical marijuana and everything to help with his own chronic pain. And so he started using the NeuBie. It helped him get out of pain and get to the point where he could actually go out and fight back in, it was 2020 or 21 when he fought that exhibition against Roy Jones Jr. So he was working with a guy named Brad Rowe, who was using the NeuBie with him every day for the 6 months leading up to that fight. And it helped him just, activate his muscles so he could train and move and do all the things he was doing without pain. So there's this great video of him talking about how, man, without that machine, like, I remember why I retired. I had all this joint pain and everything, but when I get in that machine, before I get in the ring, I can fight, and credits it with like literally enabling him to get back in the ring in his early 50s.
Yeah. And he's doing it again. He's fighting Jake Paul.
That's right.
Yeah. He's fighting Jake Paul in like a few months. Definitely be rooting for Mike Tyson in that one. So, all right, guys, this has been a long, but honestly, a lot of these questions really flew by for me. This is a lot of really fascinating information for me. If you've experienced pain before, or you plan on experiencing pain again, probably do, because you're human. Hopefully this is really helpful. So, Garrett, I want to thank you again for joining on and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Cool. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it inspires you to be a better man. I'll see you on the next episode. If you like that episode, check out this other one right here. I think you're really going to enjoy it. If you haven't subscribed, click this subscribe button over here, and you can listen to the full episodes on any major podcasting platform. Full details below in the description.